لا إله إلا الله محمد رسول الله.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلوات وتم التسليمات على سيدنا محمد وعلى وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. So those of you who were not tuned in or here yesterday, we said that we would be trying to go over the second set of maqamat or spiritual stations as elucidated by Imam al-Ansari radiallahu anhu from Herat, city in Afghanistan. And we had done the first 10, I think, more or less in previous sessions at Seekers and other places, so that's why I wanted to go to the second. But basically the first set of 10 are more focused on, let's say, spiritual purification of one's deeds, one's a'mal. And we said that Harawi is working his way to getting at the lub, or the essence of how those deeds can be purified. So not just at the level of the deeds themselves, but the individual and the heart of the individual. So in the second set of stations, these 10, he's looking at ahwal. He's looking at the hal. And the hal is defined as something that is kind of a temporary spiritual state, but that can turn into or can develop into what's called a maqam, where it then becomes something that is solidified within the heart of the seeker or the wayfarer. So when we say, for example, that to tell someone, be patient with your affair, have sabr for this thing, this calamity or this unfortunate event that happened to you. If you exhibit patience right then and there for that particular thing, then you could say you were in a hal, you were in a particular temporary state of patience. But it may not necessarily be the maqam of sabr, right? This is what the Prophet ﷺ referred to when he said, إِنَّمَا الصَّبْرَ عَنْدَ الصَّدْمَةِ الْأُولَى, that patience, when we can infer of the maqam, is patience at the first initial shock, right? So the first initial shock of hearing about this, but your heart is contented with it and reconciled towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with it, then someone like that, he doesn't need or she doesn't need people to say to them, be patient, right? Because their heart is in that place. Whereas the had could be something that comes and goes. So he's going to try to look at some of these things and how we can kind of reconcile them within our heart. And as I said yesterday, a lot of these things, what we would look at them and we say, well, aren't those emotions, right? But emotions, right, in other words, things that we feel, are very important in terms of making progress on our spiritual struggle, right? Because spiritual struggle is going to be about having conflicting emotions or having, not feeling right about certain things inside. And so there's going to be a way by which we can kind of take that on and work towards a better place. So the first bab that he contends with is Bab al-Huzn, or the chapter of grief. And when we think of grief, right, in the general sense as an emotion, we think it's negative, and we don't want to be in a grieving state, right? We may need it because of some calamity that happened, but it's not something you want to be there for a long time. Imam al-Harawi is going to show us that there are certain things that we should be grievous over. We should have some grief about them that are important, and not the things that people would normally have grief about. So he's looking here at the disposition of the seeker, not of someone who grieves because they went to Starbucks and they didn't have the coconut almond latte that they usually get and they only had the soy milk instead. I'm not talking about that type of grief, but grief over things that they should have grief over. And one of the methodology of Imam al-Harawi is to start with a verse of the Quran, which is going to be indicative. So he says, قال الله عز وجل تولوا وأعينهم تفيض من الدمع حزنا. And he just this is what's called iqtibas. He's only taking part of the verse because he's concentrating on a particular meaning from that verse. Now this verse was in Surah At-Tawbah, and it's talking about the people who, back in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, there was no professional army. So if you wanted to participate in the campaign, you had to equip yourself, provide your own camel, your own horse, your own weaponry, everything, unless someone was willing to donate. There wasn't a professional army to equip you. So some of these people came to the Prophet ﷺ, they wanted to join, and the Prophet ﷺ didn't have any more of the donated material or equipment or horses and so forth. So تَوَلَّوْا وَأَعْيُنُهُمْ تَفِيضُ مِنَ الدَّمْعِ حَزَنًا أَلَّا يَجِدُوا مَا يُنْفِقُونَ. They turned away and they were crying, or they were tearing. They were in anguish because they didn't have that which to equip themselves. So he says here, الحزن توجع لفائت أو تأسف على ممتنع. Grief is anguish over something that has elapsed, or regret over something that cannot be had. And that's how people experience grief, right? Something happened, you didn't want it to happen, feel sad about it. Or you desired something, you were looking for it, and you were not able to attain it. وَلَهُ ثَلَاث دَرَجَاتٍ. And it has 3 levels, right? And this is the hierarchy that we were referring to earlier in the previous class. One is higher than the next. So the first level, he says, حزن العامة هو حزن على التفريط في الخدمة وعلى التورط في الجفاء وعلى ضياع الأيام. The first level of grief, and he calls it al-amma, the common people. Here when he says common people, he's not meaning like common people like the people in the street. He's saying those min ammat as-salikin, those people who are kind of setting out on the wayfaring or the kind of the spiritual struggle path, the common amongst them, not the elite amongst them. So he's saying their grief then is going to be over negligence in carrying out one's devotion, their khidmah, and embroiling oneself in alienation, and grief over days that are lost. So here, when he says grief over negligence in carrying out one's devotion, he's not talking about skipping a fard prayer. That would be a sin, right? That would be something that would be covered in the first 10 chapters. We're talking about the next chapters now. We're dealing about ahwal, so it's no longer about the deeds. These 10 here, we're talking about people who don't miss fard, on purpose, and don't skip a day of fasting because they don't feel like it. And no, we're talking about people who kind of committed, and I think everybody here, inshallah, is like that. So he's talking about people who are in that particular place. So grief over negligence in carrying out one's devotion in terms of level of service and khidmah, or ritual devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Feeling like there was a time that, I let it elapse and maybe I wasted it and I should have been doing something more. And so I feel a little bit of anguish, grief over that. And that's largely positive, right, to feel that way. وَعَلَى التَّوَرُّطِ فِي الْجَفَاءِ, and embroiling oneself in what's called the jafa, or alienation. This word jafa comes a lot. And it's what's called its muqabil, in other words, its opposite is called uns. And the best way to describe it is the feeling that sometimes people will get when they feel this sort of connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this sort of spiritual connection, a heightened sense of connection. You may get it sometimes in Ramadan, sometimes, if you go to Medina or the Kaaba in Mecca and Umrah, and you kind of feel this. And once you feel it, you want to have it all the time. You don't want it to go away. But however, invariably, most of the time for most people, it goes away in one form or the other. So there's a grief that comes with that, right? And so the opposite of that uns then will be al-jafa. So while you're at the Kaaba and you're there and you're kind of hudur and you're in presence, then you turn it on the TV when you're back here in Ontario or on the internet and you're looking at the Kaaba and it doesn't feel the same, right? It's not like when you were there, and it's not like the feeling that you had. So this being embroiled in this type of grief, right, is a level of grief that salikun, those who are trying to struggle with the path, they will feel it, right? It's an indication that they're at that particular point. وَعَلَى ضَيْعَ الْأَيَّامِ, and also days that are lost, that you can never regain, right? That you can't really redress. Imam Ibn Ata al-Sakandari, he says there's حقوق في الأوقات تقضى وحقوق الأوقات لا تقضى. That the obligations that are within a particular time can be made up, right? So someone misses a day of fasting because they were traveling or they were sick, or woman on her menstrual cycle, so forth, childbirth, then they can make up the day after Ramadan, right? No questions asked, as it were. It's no sin, nothing like that. But حقوق الأوقات, but the rights of the time itself, right? If we're going to personify time, then time has rights upon you. And one of the rights that it has upon you is for you not to waste it. Time doesn't like to be wasted, right? And one of the ways to waste time is to be, for example, being busy about something that may or may not happen in the future, having angst and trepidation about it, whether it's yet to come or not, and then you don't realize the haqq, you don't realize the obligation of the time that you're in right now, this second, this moment, that you should be realizing, that you should be trying to serve, the obligation of that time. And so when you realize that you let time go, and you didn't use it in the way that you wanted it to, right? You blow an afternoon, doing something that you thought, just because you didn't feel like doing anything else, and then afterwards you have this sense of regret. This is what's called ضياع الأيام, right? And if you do this often enough, then the days will turn into months, turn into years, and then 10 years of your life can go by, and you're wondering, what did I do exactly the past 10 years? Am I in the same place spiritually as I were 10 years ago, or am I in a different place? Right? Because we want to be progressing. And وَمَنْ اسْتَوَى يَوْمَهُ فَهُوَ مَغْبُونٌ, right? Whoever's 2 days, they think their 2 days are the same, has been cheated. No 2 days are the same. Either you're going up or you're going down. There's no steady state. So the grief then, at the first level, is going to be over one of those three things. The grief at the second level, الدرجة الثانية, حزن أهل الإرادة هو حزن على تعلق الوقت بالتفرق وعلى اشتغال النفس على الشهود وعلى التسلي عن الحزن وليست الخاصة من مقام الحزن في شيء. The second level of grief is people of irada. Here he translates as willpower. I don't really like that translation. I would say people who are resolute, people who have resolve, not just a question of willpower. And it is grief over the suspension of time because of spiritual dispersion. Yeah, it's a serviceable translation, but it doesn't really quite affect the meaning. تعلق الوقت بالتفرق, right? This is another mustalah, another term of the masters of this discipline of tasawwuf, or spiritual purification. Tafarruq means to be in a state of dispersion. In other words, not being in a state of presence with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the muqabal of that, the opposite of that would be al-jama', right? Allah yajma'uka alayhi. So jama' means you're put together, you're kind of there, and you don't lose sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At a lower level, it would be something like ghafla, right? But tafruqa is not ghafla. Tafruqa is for ahl al-irada, right? These are people who are a little bit more resolute. So it's not that they're in a complete sort of oblivious state to Allah, which we would call ghafla, But tafarruq means they're not feeling that that jama', that uns, that kind of connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's could be some grief, right, over the time that you didn't feel the jama'. You didn't feel that you were completely kind of focused and combined, all of you, your heart, your mind, your soul, towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وعلى اشتغال النفس عن الشهود, and grief over being sidetracked from contemplation, or shuhud, I would say witnessing, right? Because we witness Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in different ways. There are some people who witness Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before everything, or upon everything, or after everything. And there are some who witness Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all of those ways. And so, if you were not witnessing Allah, seeing the divine in everything, right, then it's not a state of shuhud. Then you're seeing the intermediaries as independent actors doing things on their own. And you don't see the divine in them. And then this will lead to higher states of objection to things. Why does it have to be like this? And why does it have to be like that? And why is it this way? But if you see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in everything, هو المحرك, right? He is the one who's actually making all of those things happen. We call that shuhud. We call that witnessing. So if you're not witnessing, then there's that time that you grieve over, subhanAllah, I blew up on that particular thing that happened, and I got angry with a family member or a child or a spouse or maybe a teacher, maybe even a student, because I was not in the state where I was witnessing all of that. And it caused me to have that particular reaction. So, اشتغال النفس عن الشهود. You're so busy with your own self, right? And being sort of egocentric that you didn't see beyond that and witness the divine in everything. وعن التسلي عن الحزن. And over being consoled from grief, right? Maybe you didn't actually, you led yourself to a state of consolement before you actually were allowed to grieve over that missed opportunity or missed witnessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you justified it in yourself somehow. So then after the fact, you think about that, you contemplate it, and there's a sense of anguish about it. Then he says something interesting. وَلَيْسَتِ الْخَاصَّةِ مِنْ مَقَامِ الْحُزْنِ فِي شَيْءٍ. He says, as for the elite, or the people who are al-khassa, the elite wayfarers, or the elite people of the tariq, there is no station of grief for them. Why? Because they're in uns with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're in this connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they're not going to grieve over these things because generally it's not going to happen to them to begin with. And you might say, well, that sounds a little bit far-fetched and impossible. How can there be such people? There are such people. There are people like that, right? For the khassa, that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed them to the degree that, every nafas, every moment of their life, there's something that's important that's happening, right? May not be something that you can see outwardly, but in their inner life and the things they contemplate and the realizations that they have and the mashahid, right, the shuhud, the things that they can witness about the reality of the universe, these things are happening for them. And so they don't have, these kind of things that we're talking about. But what we're talking about here is actually, it is praiseworthy for those people who that's where they are on the road. So they're not negative things, but it's more kind of descriptive than it is prescriptive. It's describing what things will look like, right? Because these maqamat are the thamar, the fruits of mujahadat, right? Of putting in the effort, of struggling to wake up in the morning to pray Fajr, and then after that maybe struggling to pray a few rak'ahs of tahajjud before Fajr, struggling to try to fast some days outside of Ramadan, struggling to keep your anger in check, struggling to stay away from frivolous things and meaningless things, whether on the internet or TV. And those are all struggles we all have, right? Everyone is struggling with that. And so some of the thimar, the fruits of that, is these maqamat, right? these type of inner states one may experience at one point or another. And so he's describing, no question that he must have gone through them, because this is not a theoretical description. This is a description of somebody who lived them, who saw them, right? Just like the other arbab of this discipline, Imam al-Ghazali, Imam al-Haddad, and others, Imam al-Jilani, Shadhili, all of them, they went through this, and so they're able to impart it to others because they've been on that path. And that's why we said the human aspect is so important to make a living tradition, because if you just have the book and the text, right, without someone who's kind of at least describing to us what they've seen and saw, and then describe to us, the signposts along the way, how else are you going to know them? You need a guide, right? You need to be guided sometimes, which is another sort of counterintuitive notion in the modern era, that we need people to guide us. We're always left with the impression that you got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps and, roll up your sleeves and do it all yourself. And while there's some validity to that, but in terms of, where you can go, when you have a guide, you'll get there much quicker and much more soundly, and you may get lost if you try to do it by yourself. So he said, even though there's no kind of مقام الحزن الخاصة, he says, ولكن الدرجة الثالثة من الحزن, there is a third level of grief. And he says, التحزن للعارضات دون الخواطر ومعارضات القصود والاعتراضات على الأحكام. However, the third level of grief relates to those who are saddened by obstacles. See, this is not a good translation here. He says concepts. Khawatir is fleeting thoughts. So those who are saddened by, and mu'arid is something that gets in the way of your particular struggle. And it might be leaving something that was better for something that was less. Right? There was a better thing you could have done in this particular place, but you chose the less, not the worst thing, but the thing not as good as you could have chosen. And so it kind of formed this sort of hijab or mini veil for you. And then you grieve over that I could have done it this way, right? I could have had this reaction. And this is a higher level than the ones before it, right? Remember, each level is successively higher. So here we're not talking about sins, but we're talking about something unexpected came up, and the way that you handled the situation was not in a way that you think you could have done in a better way. ومعارضة القصود والاعتراضات على الأحكام. So معارضة القصود also means that sometimes we're going to have things that are not going to help our intention in a particular thing. So right, so the intention, he's saying, is, sometimes even the salik on their path, they have kind of a blueprint in their mind of how they think things are supposed to go, right? Of like, I need to do step 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to be in this place, right? And, this particular place in life right now, where I'm at, I can see how it's going to, and that's just human nature, see how it's going to go. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides that it's not going to be that way for you. He's going to take you in a completely different direction, right? And not in the direction that you had wanted or that you had intended, right? Maybe you thought, mashallah, I made all this money in my business, and now I see the doors of charity giving opening up, and you start to establish these charities and so forth, and you think, this is where all of the, inshallah, the futuh, the openings will have for me. But, something happens in your investments and it's all gone the next day. So that what you thought, which is going to be what was your path, it was going to be, turned out it doesn't look like it's going to be your path, and Allah takes you a completely different way. Maybe He wants to take you through the path of humility, right? Because maybe in that path that you were seeking, you weren't quite so humble about it. And Allah wants to take a better path with you, and it may be the path of humility. You don't know. So the people who are in this third level of grief, right, they may have a grief about that which gets in the way of what they thought would be their intention. Right? They're still trying to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it didn't quite exactly fit the blueprint that they were looking at. وَالْاعْتِرَاضَاتِ عَلَى الْأَحْكَامِ, and objections against the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is similar to the second one. So you feel there's kind of a grading thing when you object to something that Allah wills for you, that grates you, right? For some people, it grates them in the sense that they really want that other thing to happen, and they're upset the other thing didn't happen. He's not talking about that here. He's talking about the fact that you realize about yourself you had an objection that bothers you, right? I know I'm supposed to acquiesce to this thing. I know I'm supposed to accept it. I know that I'm supposed to be all right with it, but I'm not. My hal is I'm not all right with it. And it bothers me that I'm not all right with it. That's why it's on the third level, right? The one who's objecting to the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's not in this section at all. But we're talking about the one who realizes, or she realizes about herself, that, I should have had a better attitude about that. And the fact that I acted out, or the fact that even this could all be happening inside, it could be inner thoughts, it could have nothing to do with something that you acted outwardly, but this is a conversation that you're having in your head. So the grief that will happen over al-i'tiradat al-ahkam. And that is the first bab of grief, or of huzn. So to wrap it up, we see that particular chapter it gives us insight that grief itself, anguish, or we'll call it sadness, is part and parcel of who we are. And it depends upon what you get sad over, right? So it's not about nixing your emotions and removing them, right? And Islam doesn't want from us to be this sort of automaton, robotic, kufi wearing, jubba wearing, sibha holding, robot that looks and acts and talks the part, and there's nothing going on inside, right? And then just outwardly all these things are happening. It's not about mazahir. It's not about it's not so much about the outward aspect, but it's developing the inward aspect. And so Allah created us with emotions, right? He created within us the ability to feel compassion, to feel mercy, to feel angry, to feel sad, to feel despondent, to feel many, many different types of emotions. But the source of those emotions will be how we understand and look at the world, how we look at the universe. Right? So I made in jest someone who gets despondent over not getting the vanilla latte or whatever that they wanted at Tim Hortons. It's Canada, Tim Hortons, not Starbucks. But I was being facetious, but some people, that's where they're at. Right? That's kind of their context. That's what's going to make them despondent, and that's where they're going to be at. So the emotion itself is not, let's say, for lack of a better word, wrong, but the thing that brought it about, what precipitated it, right, was not based upon a sound understanding of who you are, where you came from, and where you're going. When it, however, does function from those three things of knowing who you are, and where we came from and where we're going, and then those emotions are elicited, then use them, right? Then they could be a positive thing. They're not a negative thing. There's something then becomes a maqam of a spiritual person, which is something that is praiseworthy. It's not blameworthy. So that's, hopefully that gets through. That's kind of the theme here. So the next chapter is Bab al-Khawf, or fear. So fear also gets a bad rap often, right? People say that, the heroic amongst them will say the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, right? And especially amongst people who think they're masculine or this sort of macho kind of attitude, shouldn't be afraid of anything and that type of thing. But there is a type of righteous fear or an important type of fear that has to be part of who we are. قال الله عز وجل يخافون ربهم من فوقهم. Allah says they fear their Lord above them. So the best type of fear then, or really the only most legitimate type of fear, is fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then you might say, well, doesn't Allah quote the shaitan in the Quran, and he said that too? Didn't he say, إِنِّي أَخَافُ اللَّهِ? Surah Al-Anfal. Isn't there a verse there? Indeed, there is. But there's different ways of fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? There could be sort of the kind of naked fear of khawf al-uquba, right? Of just fear of the consequences that will happen to you, right? Or fear of a missed opportunity, that type of fear. But look at this particular verse, يَخَافُونَ رَبَّهُمْ مِنْ فَوْقِهِمْ, right? And this fawqiyya is not a physical one. Above them, it's not a physical above, because Allah cannot be described in any of the cardinal directions. He's not above or below or south or west or north or anything like that. That's impossible for His Majesty. So it's khawf makana. So in Arabic we have khawf makan and makana. Makana means the place, the maqam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right, like in the other verse, وَمَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَى فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَى. So whoever fears the maqam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, it's a fear based upon knowledge of who Allah is, so that you're left in a state of taslim and awe of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not that you're afraid of the pain or the physical pain or the different types of pain that can be afflicted upon you. That is a type of fear, and it is important in some context, but that's not the fear that he's talking about here. The maqam of fear is different than a temporary state of fear. Right? Like if you see a threat coming your way and it's like a rabid animal running and it's going to bite you, I'd be afraid of that too, and I think I'm going to run. Right? Because you're afraid that thing is going to bite you, it's going to hurt, and it may even cause more damage to you. And yeah, that's fear too. But we're talking here about someone that is in the state of khawf, right? The maqam of fear means it's based upon a realization of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. So then he defines it. He says, الخوف هو الانخلاع عن طمأنينة الأمن بمطالعة الخبر وعلى 3 درجات. So, well, now this translation sometimes is really not good at all. So it's being separated from what he calls here طمأنينة الأمن, from the assuredness of being completely safe based upon مطالعة الخبر, based upon the reading or the information or being informed of what is yet to come. What he's referring to here is what's called in the Quran al-wa'id. So there's al-wa'ad wal-wa'id. So wa'ad means that which Allah promises to the believers in terms of the delights of paradise and raf'at darajat and raising of degrees and so forth. And then there's something called al-wa'id, that which Allah may threaten those who disbelieve, or al-usat amongst the mu'mineen, or those who are the corrupt amongst, even if they are believers, of what they may be taken to task in terms of punishment and chastisement. And the general principle is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yunaffidh wa'dahu. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always fulfill His promise, but He can choose, He can elect to naffidh wa'idahu aw ya'fu. He can choose to carry out His threat, or He can choose not to carry out His threat. That's the basis of al-wa'id, right? So when we talk about al-amn here, tuma'ninat al-amn, it means like when the verse talk about الذي يأمن مكر الله فلا يأمن مكر الله إلا القوم الخاسرون. Right? In other words, to feel like, oh, I'm completely self-assured, I'm going to paradise, there's no way I'm not. I'm a good person, I have a good heart, okay, I didn't do all the prayers and fasting, but I'm good inside, I'm completely self-assured that I'm going to the right place. So that's a false sense of security. So there's always has to be a little bit of khawf, right? A little bit of lack of assuredness, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing who Allah is, and Allah ممكن ينفذ وعيده أو لا ينفذ. He can carry out that threat, or He may not carry out a threat. Who are you to say where Allah is going to be and what He's going to do? And you look at the Sahaba, who are the ones, they were even promised paradise in their life. The Prophet ﷺ told them, Fulan Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, you're going to paradise. Wa Umar, you're going to paradise. But yet Abu Bakr as-Siddiq said, reportedly, if I were to have one foot in paradise and the other out, I wouldn't be assured until I have both feet in. And Umar ibn al-Khattab said that if I was informed that everybody's going to enter paradise except one person, I would be fearful I'd be the one person who's not going. So that was their level of understanding of the maqam of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they had this type of khawf, right? Which is a khawf based upon knowledge, based upon khashya, based upon reverence, not based upon, I'm just fearing pain. وَوَعَ ثَلَث دَرَجَات. He said it's 3 levels too here too. الدرجة الأولى الخوف من العقوبة وهو الخوف الذي يصح به الإيمان وهو خوف العامة وهو يتولد من تصديق الوعيد وذكر الجناية ومراقبة العاقبة. The first level of fear is the one that we are most familiar with, which is the fear of punishment. It is the fear by which faith is, he says, being perfected. I'd say it is valid, يصح الإيمان, right? Because if you don't believe that there's a hellfire and that there's a possibility that someone might end up there, then your iman is going to be not in a good state. It's going to be problematic because the Quran clearly says that. Whether Allah is going to carry that out or not, as we said in terms of the wa'id, that's something else. But to know that the possibility is there and there will be those who will be going there, this is part of iman. وَهُوَ خَوْفُ الْعَامَّةِ, right? And this is the common type of fear. وَهُوَ يَتَوَلَّدُ مِنْ تَصْدِيقِ الْوَعِيدِ, and it comes from in believing in the wa'id, as I said, knowing that the wa'id can be true, the threat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَذِكْرُ الْجِنَايَةِ, and also remembering that jinaya here means mukhalafa, means doing something that is sinful. So being aware of that, of committing this offense and not forgetting it, that it could be cause for someone to find themselves in that state. وَمُرَاقَبَةِ الْعَاقِبَةِ, and also being vigilant of the consequences of one's actions. That there's going to be a consequence, right? And consequence is not limited to this world, it's also the next world. So they're also aware, just because you didn't suffer any consequences in this life, does not mean you're going to be safe from suffering them in the next life. Right? And even Salihun, they prefer to suffer the consequences in this life rather than the one in the next life. That's الدرجة الأولى, the first level. الدرجة الثانية خوف المكر في جريان الأنفاس المستغرقة في اليقظة المشوبة بالحلاوة. The second level is fear of deceit. I wouldn't say deceit, makr, I would say Here in this context, usually we say makr means deception or deceit, but not when we're talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why this translation is problematic. It means that lack of assuredness. So he's saying here, fear of perhaps something else will turn out other than what I think, right? Just because I feel that my anfas, my breaths are taken in and it's completely immersed in this halawa and this sweetness, right? So I feel a sweetness of connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But that doesn't guarantee that I'm going to be one amongst the dwellers of paradise. Why? Because there is the possibility of what we called here al-makr. فَلَا يَأْمَنُ مَكْرَ اللَّهِ إِلَّا الْقَوْمُ الْخَاسِرُونَ. Right? Al-makr means that you may be thinking that's where you're at. Right? And this word that they use oftentimes is called istidraj. سَنَسْتَدْرِجُهُمْ مِنْ حَيْثُ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ وَأُمْلِي لَهُمْ إِنَّ كَيْدِي مَتِينٌ. The people of istidraj are those who seemingly everything in life works out for them. Everything is easy. Wealth comes by easily, friends come by easily, influence comes by easily, status, prestige, everything is kind of easy, and then they are lulled into a false, this is what I mean by makr, false sense of security, because they say, well, if things were supposed to be, if Allah's not happy with me, then why would everything in my life be so easy? This is istidraj, it's just giving them a pause, right? وَأُمْلِي لَهُمْ, right? I give them pause, but I'm not going to forget about them, right? There will be a comeuppance. If there are people who are of iniquity, there are people who are corrupt, there will be a comeuppance. So then the question becomes, how do I know if I'm a person of istidraj, or if I'm a person fa'lan who's really in a state of blessing? Well, how are you ma'al amr wa nahi? How are you with the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Right? If you're someone who's very lackadaisical about the commands, about prayer, about service to others and treating others kindly and so forth, and you're kind of this ogre in the house, but yet everything is going so easily for you, and Allah's not taking you to task right now, inta mustadraj. You're in a state of istidraj, right? And the thing about istidraj is you don't realize you're in it until it's too late. But the people who think, right, the people of salah, the people who are of taqwa, the people of iman, and they think they're in a state of istidraj, it means they're actually not. They're just being careful not to lend themselves to a false sense of security because of the blessings and of the feeling of sweetness that they have around them. So here he's describing the fear of such a people, right? That's the second level of fear. That even though, alhamdulillah, I go to seekers and I study with Shaykh Faraz and I'm taking notes and all these things, and things in my life are kind of lining up, I should not let that put me in a position where I am too assured of al-khatimah. I don't know how I'm going to end up. So that means I have to be still on my toes, as it were, until I take my last breath. There's no autopilot in life, right? There's no like, oh, I reached this place, and now everything is fine. My bank account of good deeds is high enough that I could be just living off of the returns, the yearly interest returns after this. No, you need to add. You still need to be making deposits, right? You're not going to be able to what's the opposite of deposit? Withdrawals. You can't make any withdrawals until the next life. You're not going to make withdrawals in this life. The withdrawals happen in the next life. But in this life, you're going to keep adding to your deposit, right, and not taking any withdrawals on it, whether interest-based or otherwise, until the next life. وليس في مقام أهل الخصوص وحشة الخوف إلا هيبة الإجلال. So similar to what he said in the previous chapter, he said for the people, أهل الخصوص, for the elite amongst the salikin, there is no وحشة الخوف, right? In khawf there's a wahsha, there's a sort of discomfort with it and alienation about it, right? It doesn't make you feel like you're in this soft and sweet and secure place with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he said for Ahl al-Khusus, right, from the elite, they don't have that. What they do have is Haybat al-Ijlal, which is different. Hayba means to be in awe of something, right? When they described people who saw the Prophet ﷺ, من رآه بديهة هابه ومن خالته معرفة أحبه صلى الله عليه وسلم. Whoever saw the Prophet ﷺ بديهة, like the first time, haba, was in awe of him. People would go to meet him and they never met him before, they'd be shaking. One man was shaking in front of the Prophet ﷺ. He couldn't stop shaking, but he was in awe. This is the Prophet ﷺ in front of me, right? And he said, هون عليك. He said, I am the son of a mother who used to eat al-qadid. I am the son of a woman who used to eat the dried meat, which was, what would be like the staple for people who are not very wealthy, but of the average person. So he's like, هون عليك. But there was this hayba about the Prophet ﷺ. So hayba is the same word he's using here, haybat al-ijlal, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala عنده صفات الجمال والجمال. Jalal means these attributes of awesomeness, right? You're left in complete awe. So there's this hayba. So it's not this kind of fear of uquba, of punishment, but it's a recognition of, wow, this is Allah, right? Everything is Allah around me. There's nothing here that would have happened except had He not willed it, and He executed it, and He made it happen, and He wanted it to be exactly this way, and it was within His knowledge, min al-azal, right, from even before before time, as it were, al-azal and pre-eternity. So that's haybat al-ijlal. وهي أقصى درجة يشار إليها في غاية الخوف وهي هيبة تعارض المكاشف أوقات المناجاة وتصون المشاهد أحيان المسامرة وتقسم المعاين بصدمة العزة. So he's describing this hayba, right? And he says it is the highest level that can be pointed out as so far as fear is concerned. So when we talk about fear of al-khassa or of the elite, we don't say fear, we say hayba, right? Haybat al-ijla. It is هيبة تعارض المكاشف أوقات المناجاة, right? It is something that can come to someone who things are unveiled to them of the divine realm. أوقات المناجاة, in the times of spiritual contemplation, like tahajjud, or even just sitting alone in khalawat, sitting by oneself and contemplating things, and they're overcome with this sense of, you feel really small and you feel really insignificant and compared to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're overwhelmed by the grandeur and the awesomeness of the divine reality. وتصون المشاهد أحيان المسامرة. And also it maintains the mushahid, in other words, the one who is witnessing the divine reality and everything. It keeps you a little bit into check, because the mushahid can have, the other side of that is called sort of this euphoria about it, or called bust, right? And then you become so beside yourself in terms of the joy and the happiness that you may feel, right, when you come into these conclusions. And when you're in that state, if left unchecked, you can do things that are strange and weird and outside of the proper boundaries of adab. So sometimes when they talk about shatahat, right, which are words that sometimes these people are in these sort of esoteric states that they say that comes out. They don't really mean them, but the state overwhelms them. Ana huwa wa huwa ana, subhani, so forth. Allah fi jaybi kada. These things that have come out with some of them of kibar al-arifin, they're not to be taken literally, right? When he says, I am he and he is me, it means that the veil has been lifted. He no longer sees himself as this sort of significant entity, and then he sees the divine in everything. But when it came out in words, it came out wrong. So here, the mushahid, tasun al-mushahid, means siyana, right? It keeps them into check, this level of hayba, right? So you clearly see the distinction between you and the divine, obviously, but the hayba of it all, the grandeur and the awesomeness of it all keeps you in that place. وتقسم المعاين بصدمة العزة. Here he calls المعاين غير المشاهد, And mu'ayyan would be a higher level of shuhud, which means that it's like you actually see him. Right? Like the hadith says, تَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ كَأَنَّكَ تَرَى مَا الْإِحْسَانِ تَعْبُدُ اللَّهَ كَأَنَّكَ تَرَى. To worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as if you see him. So, as I said, this mu'ayyan, sometimes they'll see it, and again, this euphoric state. So, صدمة العزة, right? The shock of the izzah, the power and the awesomeness and the dignity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps you from going outside of those bounds. And the greatest of the arifun, they didn't really fall into those problems because they were in check, because they had this balance. So when you talk about the level of amma, the average person, we talk about a balance between fear and hope. Al-khawf wal-raja. So fear of Allah's punishment, but also hope for Allah's mercy. And that's how we have to maintain that balance. But when you get to higher levels of understanding and suluk, it's no longer just about fear and hope. It's going to be al-qabd wal-bast, or al-uns wal-wahsha. Right? Different words that now the focus of the fear or the focus of the hope will be different things. So there'll be less about the things that Allah has created, because at the end of the day, paradise and hellfire created things, right? But then when the focus becomes more aligned with tawheed, to wahid Allah, and Allah is only one, which means that even the paradise and the hellfire seem small next to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not that they're small, but in comparison to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then the real focus should be Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So then the fear and hope, we don't use those words anymore. Right? We'll use different words. We'll say uns, right? Or we'll say jama' wa tafruqa, as we said in the previous one. So jama', that you are in focus and hudur with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and tafruqa, you have momentary, what are not really lapses, but less shuhudic, if the word suffices, or not as not as intense as other times when you're in the munajah and when you're in the kind of focused ibadah, or the focused khalwa, or the focused uzla, or focused isolation that you might have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I'm going to stop here, hoping I didn't confuse you more than I intended to, inshallah, and we'll take a break for Asr, and then we'll come back after that. But if you have a question, that's okay. Yeah.
Yes, please. So in the Quran, there is في القرآن في كما تفضلت الخوف والرجاء، بس في أي reference للأنس في القرآن الكريم؟
So al-wajih, the question was, we see the words khawf and raja expressed in the Quran, but is there the word uns? The Quran uses words in different contexts. And so I think before you came, we said that, for example, the word khawf is used in different ways. The shaitan says, inni akhafu Allah in the Quran. And at the same time, يَخَافُونَ رَبَّهُم مِّن فَوْقِهِمْ وَمَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَى. Can we say the word khawf in those two verses are the same as the one when shaitan says it? Abadan. So in order to differentiate, they have mustalahat. They have different terms to refer to the varying degrees or levels of khawf as it applies to different people in different spiritual kind of understandings. So I would say maybe not the word, the term, because now it's terminology, but the concept, clearly yes. Every single one of these chapters, he prefaces it with ayah min al-Quran. To show you al-asl jay min al-Quran, and then he goes and explicates how he understood it from that particular verse. So this is really more like almost a tafsir of the Quran. Yeah.
So there's an inference to uns.
Tamam. Tamam. Ahsant. Yes.
You mentioned like if accepting the last path that you been guided towards. Say like you mentioned of like someone losing their wealth, right? Accepting that. How do you distinguish between that and obstacles being put in your way, and not just maybe striving harder when these obstacles are put in your way?
There's no contradiction between those two things. We're talking about things that are matters of the heart. So let's say, for argument's sake, someone lost a lot of their wealth or most of it, does it mean that they should just accept being destitute? No, I'm not saying that, right? They can try to start a business again or do these other things, but they should also leave out the possibility that maybe the path that they thought they were going to take in terms of their spiritual struggle, based upon the circumstances that were prevalent or prevailing at the time, maybe that's not going to be the way. So you have to be at least willing to accept the idea maybe it's not what you want and the way that you wanted it, but maybe Allah has a different path for you. And huh?
How would you come to know which path is which? Especially when it's comes to like when you're choosing to go on something that's good, for example, seeking knowledge or going on.
No, and generally when we're making decisions like this, here I'm not talking about decision making. Here I'm talking about reconciling your heart with what your current circumstances. So it's not so much about decision. When we're making decisions, that's a different criteria. So decision making, just like anything else, is going to be based upon taking all the factors into consideration, the chance of success and all that type of thing. That's why we have this concept called istikhara and istishara. ما خاب من استخار ومن استخار ومن استشار. No one who seeks istikhara, seeking the good by asking Allah to give him the good, and seeking mashura, consultation with others who are in the know, who can help him or her make an informed decision. And so whenever we're making decisions like that, it should never be unilateral. It should always involve people that we trust and we think have our best interest out for us, and trying to understand from them, what do you think I should do? Here's my situation, and so forth. But all of that can be going on in like the outside world, but in your heart, what he was talking about is, don't think that you have even your own spiritual path outlined the way that you think it's going to be, because it may take a turn, and maybe Allah wants to take you somewhere else. So to be ready to accept that internally, even though externally you do all that you want to do, right? But internally, be prepared for the idea that Allah's taking you somewhere else, and to be able to recognize that is very important, because sometimes people can get mired and stuck in a place, and they feel it has to be exactly this way. But when enough doors get closed, that means Allah wants you to go through another door. But again, with consultation and with istikhara. And making decisions is never easy. It's difficult. I wouldn't want to be in a position to help someone make a decision, but Jazakumullah khair.